In the spring of 1917, the body of Lieutenant William McNeil, a native of the Orkney Isles, washed ashore on a remote island off the west coast of Scotland. Carried by the Atlantic currents for almost 200 miles, the story behind McNeil's death had begun weeks earlier on the night of January 25th. Local fishermen found McNeil and had buried him alongside a German sailor, washed up on the following day, saying, "In death, they are both the same." The story of the Laurentic and her sinking has been told many times in the past. Detailed accounts have been written concerning her cargo of gold and attempts to salvage the lost bullion. There is another story to be told, the story of the men who perished that night and those, fewer in number, who survived.
My name is John Madden, and I'm called after my grandfather, John. I suppose he survived the sinking of the Laurentic, and that is probably why I'm here today. He joined the British Navy, I think, in about 1896. I've inherited some postcards that were sent from Liverpool to my grandfather's brother, his sister, his then girlfriend, who would become his wife. They were posted from Liverpool a couple of days before the sailing. I also have a letter from the Lord Mayor of Derry at the time, just a general letter, I suppose, just to say hope they were all well and that he was recovering after his ordeal. I just have a photographed in a kind of it looks like a postcard. What it says is some of the lads after a hard time, and it's written in my grandfather's handwriting. Yeah.
On January 23rd, 1917, the Laurentic left her home port of Liverpool, bound for Halifax, Nova Scotia. Out in the North Channel, a number of her complement of men were suspected of having yellow or spotted fever, and, rather than risk infection spreading throughout the ship, the Laurentic was diverted to the naval base in Loch Swilly, where the men could be put ashore. It would be a fateful decision. When the Laurentic struck two mines off Fanard Head on the 25th of January 1917, she was under the command of Acting Captain Reginald Norton, an experienced naval officer. Norton had previously served aboard the Laurentic and knew the ship well. Nor was he unfamiliar with war at sea, his previous command, the HMS Hogue, having been torpedoed by a German U-boat. In this rarely seen footage, the U-boat commander responsible for sinking the Hogue and the two other ships in its convoy, an enthusiast of the newly invented cinematograph, records his mission, he and other U-boat captains meticulously logging the details of their attacks. The U-boat, which had been detected in Loch Swilly, was home in Hamburg by the time the Laurentic set sail, but she left behind a full complement of deadly cargo. Norton's account, given just a few days after the sinking, offers a particular, cool and detailed insight into the minutes and hours that followed the ship's departure from Buncrana a century ago.
The Loch Swilly Hotel, Buncrana, January the 28th, 1917. Sir, I have the honour to submit the following report of the circumstances attending the loss of my command, HMS Laurentic. I arrived at Loch Swilly before daylight on Thursday, January the 25th, anchoring 2 miles inside the boom, about 7:45 a.m. At 4 p.m, I exercised action stations, darkened ship and closed all the watertight doors, except those on D-deck.
My name is Lieutenant Commander Ronan McLaughlin. I'm originally from Mallinhead, Inishaw, County Donegal. I suppose for the night in question it would have been fairly difficult for Captain Norton because he would have had his orders, and his orders that evening were to move. And there's a lot of stories, various stories about why he had to move, when he moved, and this, that and the other. But just to give us a sense from a naval perspective or a seagoing perspective of what was required on the night. So, the captain would have ordered to weigh anchors, leave Buncrana. And I suppose the first thing on his mind was to get the ship out of the Swilly safely. So, to navigate through the channel in the Swilly, there's 3 courses. There's a northeasterly course, a northwesterly course, and then just as you're starting to come up to Fort Dunree, you're altering to starboard and you're heading on a northerly course. And I suppose his thinking would have been behind that, and the navigator would have been thinking, it's a dark night, it's a rough night, this is Donegal in January, not the most pleasant experience in the world. It's snowing as well. So from that point of view, their whole thinking probably at the time wasn't so much on the mines, maybe not so much on the war effort that was going on, but actually just the safe passage of the ship. His speed is suggested as being 8 to 10 knots, which is about right for navigating up the Swilly. And then as he's clearing Fort Dunree and heading north, he's up into 15 to 17 knots as suggested. So, there would have been a sense of, let's get out, let's navigate out safely. He would have been conscious of the people on the deck as well, because there would have been, they'd been securing boats ready for sea. Remember, these boats had just come in from Buncrana. So anybody who was on shore leave or any small tenders that were leaving the ship and this, that and the other would have been coming back from Buncrana. So they would all have to be secured. All the ropes would have to be secured on the deck. The anchors would have to be secured. So people would have been busy. And probably as he's past Dunree, he's realising, okay, I'm in more open water now. We can sit back and we can relax a little bit. Things are okay. There's nothing to suggest anything untoward is going to happen. And then all of a sudden he's coming up towards Fanad Lighthouse, and we have two very, very large explosions.
At 5 p.m, it being then dark, I got underway and proceeded out of harbour at 14 knots, increasing to full speed 17.5 knots on passing Dunree Head, where 3 trawlers passed us inward bound. I was showing no lights of any kind, nor did I make signal, thinking it was possible that there might be a submarine. Altering first a point to starboard, and about 8 minutes afterwards 3 points to port, which made the course north magnetic. After steaming for about 5 minutes on this course, at 5:55 p.m. GMT, there was a violent explosion at the port side abreast the foremast. This threw me off my feet, followed about 20 seconds afterwards by a second abreast the engine room, the port side, which caused all the lights to go out.
Although the Laurentic was under the command of the British Admiralty, the men aboard, her crew and passengers, came from far afield, from small coastal communities in Scotland, the Western Isles, from Orkney, Ireland and Canada, from Hong Kong, New Zealand and South Africa, from the industrial heartlands of England to the southern coasts of Cornwall and Devon. Some of these men had entered service in the Navy many years before the outbreak of war. Some had formed part of the Laurentic crew while she served as a luxurious transatlantic passenger ship, and a great number had been called up from the Royal Navy Reserves.
My name is Gerald Clement Yetman from Newfoundland. I gave you my middle name because Clement Yetman was the name of my great uncle. What I was able to find out was that he joined the Royal Naval Reserve. So there was a ship in St. John's called the Calypso that they trained on. He joined in 1915, came over to England and was stationed on a converted trawler. Prior to coming over, I would suspect he was a fisherman because his father did have fishing schooners. So more than likely he was involved in that. A couple of his brothers did show up in some old records as being fishermen. So he did have a fishing background. Came over here, was in the Royal Naval Reserves, was on the Magpie, and was then on his way home on leave when he was on the Laurentic. He and 20-odd other Newfoundlanders.
The sinking of the Laurentic with such heavy loss of life brought the horror and reality of war to this area where until then only heavily censored newspaper reports and a few scattered letters from men and women serving abroad told of such things. There was no war on land here, and the trenches of France and Belgium must have seemed far away. The mass funerals which took place in Faughan and Buncrana in the days immediately after the tragedy would not be the end of the story. For days and weeks, bodies would continue to be washed ashore in Lough Swilly and far beyond.
My name is Don McNeil. I'm chairperson of the Ulster Canon Initiative, the organisers of the annual Laurentic commemoration. And when I first moved here and heard the story about the Laurentic, and I was kind of shocked when I discovered that there was 22 Newfoundlanders from my home area that had died on the ship. And there was nothing being done about it, so I kind of took it upon myself to start a small commemoration. And over the past 10 years, it's gone from strength to strength to this year for the Centenary. We had 35 family members from Scotland, all over England, Ireland, and from Newfoundland that made their journey here to attend the Centenary commemoration.
My name's Alan Clare, born and bred in Liverpool, now living in Manchester. My maternal grandfather was James Robert Brown. He was an engineer with the White Star Line on a number of their ships, including the Laurentic. I've no direct memory of him. My mother, when he died, was a babe in arms of just over a year old, so she had no memory of him. So everything I knew on a personal level came from my mum, but even that was second hand from her mum, obviously. So found out quite a bit about him, knew all the dates and most of the story. So we arrived at the wreck site. We're all gathered on the quarterdeck. A little bit of a service was read and a few bits and bobs like that. And then all the family members have wreaths and what have you to pop into the water. I don't have a wreath. I have the poppy. Having after a lot of soul searching decided that it really is for my granddad. I don't know where his body is, except that I imagine it's still with the wreck. So I'd already thought that the most appropriate thing I could do would be 100 years on to drop it into the wreck. So although it was choking me up a bit as we're coming out, I stepped up to the rail and thought, right, the moment's come. Just being there, and it's only what, 140, 50 feet away. I couldn't get any closer. I think I've done the right thing by his wife, my nana, who I never met, my mum, who never knew her dad. Yeah, so it's been an intensely moving experience. I think everybody's felt the same.
It was an amazing week, very humbling. It's the people kind of just gelled together as a group and shared photographs and stories, and sort of commented on how their grandfathers and ancestors could have been friends or in the lifeboats together. And there was one moment when we were doing a tour around Dinneshaw, and they were talking about this in Mellonhead. We stopped for lunch, and Will Thompson from Liverpool hauled out his grandfather was the chief engineer. He hauled out his photo album, and there was a photo in there of all the engineering officers. And then Mike Lehman from Devon leans in and goes, "There's my grandfather next to him."
So I'm Michael George Lehman. I'm known as Mike, basically. I'm a postman from Devon in England, and my great-grandfather was the chief petty officer or boatswain on the Laurentic when it went down. And he joined the Royal Navy in, I think it was about 1879 or something like that. And he actually was retired. He'd finished. But then, with the advent of World War I, they re-enlisted him. A lot of thoughts going through my head. My mum and my great-grandfather. And I did say to the captain of the ship, when it came to the ceremony, when we were over the actual wreck, will there be a possibility that I could sound my great-grandfather's whistle, his boatswain's whistle. The whistle that he had actually left at home, and he said this would be wonderful if you think you can do it. So my mouth was very dry, but I blew the whistle out over the rear of the ship when we were right above the remains of the Laurentic, and then cast my wreath in. And I was wobbling. It was just an amazing experience.
Well, we started off, I guess, on the Wednesday, the 25th, and this is when the Tower Museum officially launched this exhibition. On Friday, The mayor of Derry went and recreated the lunch that was hosted in 1917 for the survivors. On Saturday, we turned around, we had a small church service, a wreath laying ceremony in St Mary's Church of Ireland in Fawn, followed by a wreath lay at the St Mary's Cockhill Cemetery in Buncrana, with a reception afterwards in the Tullyyard Mill.
The Laurentic disaster itself was an enormous thing in the area. It was something that people probably just couldn't comprehend at the time. I think people were put together very much by the disaster that was the huge loss of life on the Laurentic. And so when the 70 or so people were buried here a few days later, I think it would have been, although unusual for the time, probably people didn't see it as that unusual when it actually happened. An amazingly sad sight to have seen 70 men being buried here at that particular time. It probably brought home to them the whole horror of war as well. I know people went away to war and were very badly missed. People probably would have been in terror of getting the call, the telegram, whatever it was, to say they had fallen too.
One small pencil-written letter from Violet Kerr to her brother Fred writes on the very day that her sister Blanche just had word from the Admiralty that poor, dear George was lost on the Laurentic.
My dear old boy, I'm writing to tell you some very sad news indeed. I'm sure you will be upset. Blanche has just had word from the Admiralty to say that poor, dear George was lost on the Laurentic that sailed from Liverpool. She was mined or torpedoed off the Irish coast last Thursday. Poor Blanche is in bed ill. Of course, we are all very much upset indeed. I hardly know how to write and tell you. I know that he was a real good fellow in every way, and everybody liked him. Before he sailed, he went to see Mrs. Carson, and she did like him very much. His body has been washed ashore at Buncrana. You know the place. Isn't it sad, Fred? Oh dear, I do feel sorry. I am over sitting with Bea. She is upset. Well, old boy, chin up. I must be off. I have a lot to write to. We all send love. I do wish you had seen dear old George. Best of love from your loving sister, Violet.
George Gill's wife was newly pregnant. When the news arrived, the child would never know his father, and a little more than a year later, Blanche too had died. Seaman John Patrick Buckley from Youghal in County Cork, son of Patrick and Mary, was 21 years of age when he died. Dressed in his best suit, he sits among his shipmates in a treasured photograph. In another, he stands proudly in uniform. The photograph, made in Singapore, serves as a reminder of the distances that separated these young men from their homes and families. In a Christmas card sent to his sister Kathleen, just a month before his death, the verse asks that she keep one thought apart for a friend who today is afar. Well, on the reverse he signs himself, your fondest brother, along with a promise to buy her the dancing shoes she so wanted. The postcards and letters sent home from the crew of the Laurentic before the tragedy seem all the more poignant, speaking as they do of the day-to-day life of service far from home and unaware of the coming disaster. 21-year-old Ephraim Freak wrote to his mother in December of 1916 and told of his voyage from Newfoundland, how he and others from his local area were getting along, and at the excitement of finding himself in Portsmouth, where he could see more in an hour than I could in Newfoundland all my lifetime. Ephraim's excitement was soon to be replaced by disappointment and tragedy. Discharged after failing an eye test, he would be sent home aboard the Laurentic. The letter he wrote would never be delivered. Instead, it would fall beneath the counter at his local post office and lie undiscovered and unread for more than 60 years. Of the 354 men who died on the night of the sinking, many survived the 2 mine explosions which sent the Laurentic to the bottom of the loch, only to die of exposure in the lifeboats, victims of the bitter cold. Augustus Dent, who served on the ship and survived the explosions, told of his attempts to keep his crewmates in the lifeboat conscious through the night, urging them to get on an oar, knowing that if they slipped into unconsciousness, they would never wake up. Dent later would return to the Laurentic as a diver in the salvage operations. Throughout the night, the men in the lifeboats struggled to make it to land. Darkness, high cliffs, crashing waves, biting cold and rocky shorelines, making their situation all but hopeless. The Dundee People's Journal would later report in dramatic detail on the death of 20-year-old signaller Victor Yule. As the day broke, Yule's boat was found by a local trawler, and of the 35 men aboard, not all had survived the night. Still working at the oars when the trawler pulled alongside, as the boatswain of the rescue boat reached out his hand, Victor fell forward and died where he sat, his hands still on the oars. Coastal fishing communities all over Ireland, from Youghal, Kinsale, Dunmore East and Arklow, from the Four Corners of Newfoundland, the coastal towns of Devon and Cornwall, the Highlands and the islands of Scotland and beyond were greatly affected by the tragic loss of men.
My father was born in 1895, Luke was born in 1886, I think it was, so he was older, and he had been in the reserve before Dad joined. Luke and his brother Roy and another brother John had been in it before Dad joined. They used to fish on the Labrador, and my grandfather had a schooner, and they would fish on the Labrador. And they joined the reserve because it was a way of making some extra money in the winter or early spring before the fishing season started. They would go in there for training. And I think in the earlier days they used to take a cruise maybe down to the Caribbean somewhere. Luke was coming home on leave. He wasn't a crew member of Laurentic, and Luke was married before the war broke out. His daughter, Viola was her name, was born while he was gone, so he had never seen her. And he was coming home on leave to see his new daughter when he was drowned. So she had never seen her father, of course, either.
Having paid the ultimate price of sacrificing their lives in service, the families left behind by those lost on the Laurentic would also bear a heavy burden. Mina Dyer, the widow of Harry Dyer, would be left to work as a laundress, with 3 children to raise, denied a naval pension on the basis that his body was never recovered.
My name is Yvonne O'Connor. My grandfather was a fireman on the Laurentic, and his body was never found. Words just can't describe how we feel. I can't believe that I actually had a wreath thrown into the sea over the wreck. I mean, it's going to be etched in my memory.
Many of the bodies from the Laurentic would never be recovered. The remote island where William McNeil was washed ashore, and where a marker bears his name, is said to be home of the McNeil clan, so perhaps it is fitting that he should be buried there. During his service at sea, McNeil had seen much of the world. In one account he sent home, he spoke of the terrors of a storm at sea off Cape Horn. His words are eerily evocative of the experience he and his crewmates would endure on the night of January 25th. When down came a sudden blast, the good ship staggered beneath it. She was on her beam end in a blink, and every man among us had made up our minds to sink. I gazed into the deep foaming waters while clinging to a rope, when a low rumbling noise below dashed our every hope.